Jax's revenge domain. I was scraping burnt coffee residue off the bottom of the break room pod when Brad's voice echoed down the hall, loud and self-congratulatory as always. He was probably toasting Mike or Roger or whatever eager face had just presented my risk analysis data like they'd discovered fire. I stared at the stained sponge in my hand and thought, at least this thing gets used. My name is Alan Pierce. I'm 47 years old, and for 15 years I've been the guy who keeps Whitmore Financial Corp from bleeding money through fraud and compliance gaps. Not the guy who gets credit for it. Mind you, just the guy who does it. 15 years. I sat 4 doors down from the corner office for 15 years, holding together our risk management systems with the kind of methodical precision that kept regulators happy and executives sleeping well at night. I wasn't flashy. I wasn't political. I didn't schmooze at happy hour or volunteer for those ridiculous team-building retreats where grown men throw around foam footballs and talk about synergy. But I got things done. Fixed broken fraud detection algorithms, built custom reporting systems that actually worked, streamlined our compliance workflows so tight that legal called them bulletproof before Brad made them stop using military terms because they sounded outdated. And in all that time, nobody asked what I was building after hours. I remember the moment things shifted. It was subtle at first. A nod here, a look there. They'd smile when I walked into meetings, but somehow the important conversations had already happened. I became the guy you see but don't really notice. A shadow with administrator privileges, Brad Hoffman, my boss, was always polite enough. Fresh MBA from Wharton, 33 years old, and convinced that everything before his arrival was ancient history. He called me reliable. When our fraud detection system crashed or when someone forgot to update our risk parameters and we nearly missed a major money laundering flag, I'd step in, fix it in 30 minutes, and get a nod. Not a raise, not recognition, just a nod. And somehow that was supposed to be enough. I stayed because I believed, probably stupidly, that experience mattered. That 15 years of preventing financial disasters would count for something. Spoiler alert, it didn't not there. The office was corporate beige in every possible way. Beige walls, beige meetings, beige people congratulating each other for implementing someone else's ideas 6 months late. You know the type. Folks who get promoted for suggesting we use a new dashboard template or proposing a Slack channel for birthday reminders. Meanwhile, I was writing risk assessment protocols at midnight because our fraud detection system hadn't been properly updated since the 2008 crisis. I remember just once, offering an idea in a team meeting. A lightweight application I'd started working on at home, something that could identify suspicious transaction patterns before they hit our main systems. Real-time fraud prevention with one-click investigation tools. Brad smiled, that patronizing smile he'd probably practiced in business school. Said we weren't looking for side projects. Told me to focus on what I did best, keeping the trains running on time. So I did. Quietly, I built the application anyway. Spent weekends refining it, writing algorithms that could spot fraud patterns across multiple account types, cross-referencing with federal watch lists, running stress tests. I even designed the interface myself, clean and practical, called it RiskGuard Pro. At first, it was just a folder on my personal laptop. By year 2, it was a functioning tool. By year 3, it was better than anything Whitmore was using internally, and still, I said nothing. Not because I was scared, but because I knew how this place worked. If I demonstrated it, they'd either dismiss it or worse, appropriate it, rewrite history, so Mike from compliance was suddenly the visionary, and I was just the guy who helped with the technical details. So I kept it off their network, documented every development phase, stored everything in external cloud services, wrote detailed version logs, built a paper trail that would make any IP lawyer smile. I was quiet, but I wasn't stupid. There's something surreal about being invisible in your own workplace. Watching others take credit for problems you solved. Sitting through meetings where someone suggests something you implemented 6 months ago, like it's revolutionary thinking. But here's the thing about being overlooked for too long. You either disappear completely or you learn to operate independently. I chose independence. By the time the holiday party rolled around, the pieces were already in motion. I just hadn't shown my hand yet. Brad called an all-hands meeting and stood there like he was about to announce the cure for financial crime. Pressed shirt, confident grin, coffee mug with some motivational quote his assistant probably picked out. We're doubling down on internal development, he said like a general addressing troops. No more outside distractions, no personal projects. Everything goes through proper channels moving forward. I glanced around the conference room. A few people nodded automatically. Someone actually applauded. I just sat there feeling my stomach tighten. 18 months, that's how long I'd been perfecting RiskGuard Pro. Nights, weekends, after fixing Brad's broken project timelines and rebuilding risk models that nobody else wanted to touch. My application wasn't a distraction. It was an insurance policy, one I'd built by hand while they argued about office furniture and team-building budgets, so I raised my hand, calm, steady. I've actually been developing something in that space. A fraud prevention tool, real-time analysis, scalable architecture. I could demonstrate it. Brad didn't even pause. Let's not reinvent the wheel, Alan, he said, flashing that rehearsed smile he used when dismissing ideas. I'm sure it's interesting, but enterprise-level security isn't something you build in your garage. He never asked what programming language I'd used. Never asked what fraud patterns it detected. Never asked which compliance standards it met. He didn't even look. After the meeting, I sat in the parking garage for 20 minutes, just staring at my steering wheel. You know that moment when you realize someone has become so accustomed to overlooking you that they've gone functionally blind? Not just to your work, but to your capabilities entirely. I was past frustrated, past angry. It felt clinical, like watching someone consistently choose the wrong answer when they had all the information they needed to choose correctly. Then 3 days later, a gift disguised as an administrative error arrived in my inbox. Legal had copied me by mistake on an internal thread about personal projects and intellectual property. The subject line read, Pierce Application Management Review. The message was brief, MGMT reviewed. Not aligned with current priorities, no IP filing requested. Treat as personal hobby project. I stared at that email for a full minute. No IP filing requested. Treat as personal hobby project. Translation: I was legally clear. They'd formally declined interest. And now, if I walked away with my application, they couldn't touch a single line of code. I quietly saved that email in a folder I labeled documentation and started making calls. The firm was called Sentinel Risk Solutions. Professional office, no corporate buzzword posters, and nobody tried to explain why their open plan workspace would revolutionize my creativity. Just 3 partners and a legal advisor who asked the right questions. The kind that told me they'd actually read the financial crime prevention guidelines before deciding to build a business around them. I liked them immediately. I'd rehearsed my presentation for weeks, but once I sat down, it just flowed. I pulled up RiskGuard Pro on my laptop, ran a live demonstration using sanitized transaction data, and in under 6 seconds, the system flagged 4 potential money laundering patterns and mapped suspicious activity across 3 different account types. 2 clicks, immediate results, clean visual reports. They didn't just nod politely, they leaned forward. You built this independently. One partner asked. In my spare time, I replied. Then I pulled out my documentation folder. Development logs with timestamps. Cloud service receipts in my name. Screenshots of the internal email where Whitmore explicitly waived interest. They declined to review it, I explained. It's mine. There was a long pause. Then came the question I'd been waiting for. What would it take for us to license this? I didn't name a figure immediately. I'd done my research. Similar fraud prevention tools were licensing for 15 to 25 million, depending on capabilities and client base. But I didn't want to just sell it. I proposed a partnership, usage rights in exchange for development funding, legal support, and market access. A joint venture, not an acquisition. They agreed before our second meeting ended. By December, we had signed agreements. RiskGuard Pro would operate under a newly formed joint entity. I'd retain technical ownership and development control. They'd provide capital and handle business development. It was the cleanest deal I'd ever been part of, and nobody raised their voice once. Then I went back to Whitmore. Every morning I showed up at 8:15. Not too early to seem overeager, not too late to appear disengaged. I fixed Brad's broken dashboard again when he realized someone had corrupted his quarterly reporting metrics. I stayed late one Tuesday to help a junior analyst push through a compliance update that someone else would present on Friday. And through it all, I said nothing. No announcements, no hints. I didn't even change my routine. Same navy suits, same sensible sedan, same invisible presence in a building that assumed it still controlled my professional future. There's something almost meditative about walking around a place that thinks it owns your next career move while knowing it doesn't even own your current project. Every time Brad made jokes about keeping innovation in-house, I just nodded. Every time someone talked about the importance of team players, I agreed completely. Let them believe what they needed to believe. By then, our development team was already migrating my code to enterprise servers. The patent applications were filed and pending. The first client contracts were being negotiated through partners in Chicago and Denver. We even landed a pilot program with a risk management firm I'd contacted a year earlier when Whitmore never returned their inquiry about fraud prevention consulting. My world split cleanly in two, past and future. One held my employee ID badge, the other held my name on legal documents, and I wasn't in any rush. Let them sleep. Let them think I was still theirs to overlook. The beauty of being underestimated is that nobody notices when you stop seeking approval and start building alternatives. And mine was about to go public. By the time I walked into Whitmore's holiday party, the usual crowd was already gathering around the bar that somebody had optimistically set up next to the photocopier. The conference room had been transformed with string lights and cheese platters that looked like they'd been ordered from the same catalog for the past decade. Someone had queued up a playlist that alternated between holiday classics and that instrumental jazz that makes you feel like you're trapped in an elevator. Nobody really noticed me at first, which was standard. I was wearing the same charcoal suit I'd worn to last year's party. Hair combed the same way I'd combed it for 15 years. No name tag needed, no guest to introduce. Just me, a glass of decent whiskey, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing I didn't need to pretend anymore. I found a spot near the wall, close enough to hear conversations, but far enough away to avoid small talk about weekend plans and quarterly projections. Brad was already holding court near the front of the room. This year's been about people who really stepped up, he announced, raising his glass like he was addressing shareholders. People who made Whitmore what it is today. Here came the list. Mike from compliance, who'd successfully implemented a reporting system I'd designed 6 months earlier. Roger from operations, who discovered the value of automated alerts after I'd spent 3 weeks rebuilding our notification protocols. Polite applause, forced smiles. Someone actually whistled. My name didn't come up. Not that I expected it to, but there was something almost funny about watching a highlight reel of my own work being credited to other people. I turned toward the bar and ordered another whiskey. As I waited, someone appeared beside me with the kind of grin that always followed 2 beers and no filter. "You still working on that side project?" he asked. Like we were sharing an inside joke. I smiled, small and easy. "Not anymore." He laughed. "What?" "It finally crashed." "Man, I told you that thing was probably too complicated for weekend programming. You should have brought it to Brad earlier. Could have saved yourself some time." I took a sip of my drink. Let the silence stretch just long enough. "No, I sold it." He blinked. "Wait, what?" The words weren't loud. I didn't make an announcement or call for attention, but they were just clear enough for the conversation around us to pause slightly. Enough for the bartender to glance over. Enough for Brad, standing 6 feet away and basking in applause from Mike's quarterly numbers, to turn his head mid-sentence. "I sold it," I repeated, calm and matter-of-fact, like I was confirming tomorrow's weather forecast. The guy squinted at me, waiting for a punchline that wasn't coming. Behind him, I could see Brad staring, his expression shifting from confusion to something approaching recognition. "You're serious?" he asked. I didn't elaborate. Just raised my glass, took another sip, and let the moment settle like dust after an explosion. He stared at me for several seconds, his brain clearly trying to process information that didn't fit his assumptions. "You actually sold it? That thing you were always working on?" Brad had stopped talking entirely now. The room's energy was shifting, conversations trailing off as people sensed something happening without quite understanding what. "How much?" Brad's voice cut through the background noise, sharp and direct. I looked at him steadily. No drama, no theatrics. Just a man stating a simple fact, 58 million. You could feel it hit the room like a physical thing. Not just silence, but that particular kind of quiet that happens when everyone's brain stops processing for a moment. The guy next to me choked on his beer so hard it came out his nose. His glass hit the bar with a clatter, and he coughed, sputtering. "Jesus, what?" Brad's face went through several expressions in rapid sequence. Disbelief, calculation, something that might have been panic. "You're not serious." I took another sip of my whiskey, perfectly calm. The announcement goes public Monday. That's when the room really stopped. Not just our conversation, but everything. The background chatter, the clinking glasses, even the terrible jazz seemed to pause. I could see it spreading through the crowd like a wave. The woman from HR who'd never learned my first name, the guy from IT who'd always treated me like tech support, the junior analysts who'd somehow never noticed that I'd been solving their problems for 15 years. Someone from legal had been mid-sentence across the room. I watched their conversation collapse into nothing as the words 58 million reached their table. A woman from accounting who'd barely acknowledged my existence was already pulling out her phone, probably checking financial news sites for press releases that hadn't been published yet. I didn't move, didn't gesture, just let the truth settle where all their assumptions used to be. I'd spent 15 years fixing their problems, improving their systems, making everyone else look competent while staying invisible. Not anymore. I set my glass down gently. No ceremony, no speech. Just the weight of reality replacing years of being overlooked. RiskGuard Pro, I said quietly, answering the question nobody had asked yet. Fraud prevention system. Sentinel Risk Solutions wanted exclusive licensing rights. Brad's mouth opened and closed, like he was trying to speak underwater. I didn't need applause, they were already speechless. By Monday morning, the office felt different. Quieter conversations, glances that broke away when I passed, the kind of careful politeness people use when they realize they've been fundamentally wrong about someone. My keycard still worked somehow. Maybe nobody had thought to deactivate it, or maybe nobody wanted to be the one to make that call. Brad's assistant intercepted me before I reached my desk. He wants to see you, of course he did. I walked into his office to find him standing instead of sitting, which told me everything about his state of mind. Brad only stood during meetings when he was angry, desperate, or trying to establish dominance. Today he looked like all three. "Close the door," he said, voice tight. I did. He turned to face me, arms crossed like a disappointed parent. "You developed that system while employed here?" "Yes." "Using company resources?" "No." "Personal laptop, external servers, independent development environment. I documented everything. We'll need to verify there's no intellectual property conflict." I didn't say a word. Just pulled out the folder I'd been carrying for months. Thick, organized, and labeled like evidence in a legal proceeding. I placed it on his desk and slid it forward, deliberate and unhurried. He opened it. First page. Development logs with timestamps showing 18 months of work, all conducted off-site, off-network, on personal equipment. Next, cloud service invoices billed to my name, payment confirmations, server rental agreements. Then, screenshots of internal emails, including the legal thread where they'd explicitly declined interest. MGMT reviewed, not aligned with current priorities. No IP filing requested. Brad's eyes moved across the pages. His jaw tightened as he realized how thoroughly I'd anticipated this conversation. "Why didn't you bring this to us?" he finally asked. "You never asked." He closed the folder but didn't push it back. Just left it sitting there like evidence of his own oversight. "You understand how this looks," he said quietly. "I understand exactly how this looks." For the first time since I'd known him, Brad didn't sound confident or dismissive. He sounded small. "Are you planning to stay?" I considered the question for a moment. "I'm considering my options." He reached for his coffee mug like it might rescue him from drowning in his own miscalculation. I stood slowly, straightened my jacket, and moved toward the door. Right before opening it, I said the only thing that mattered. "You didn't lose a system, Brad. You lost someone who could have built you 10 more. Then I walked out, leaving him alone with proof that he'd never understood what was sitting 4 doors down the hall. The call came Wednesday afternoon. I was at home reading the Wall Street Journal article about Sentinel Risk Solutions' acquisition of revolutionary fraud prevention technology when my phone rang. "This is Patricia Coleman from Whitmore Legal," the voice said, too bright and too careful. "We were wondering if there might be an opportunity to discuss licensing arrangements for internal use of your system." I almost smiled. 3 days ago, it was a hobby project that wouldn't scale. Now it was a licensing opportunity. "I'd be open to a conversation," I said. "Wonderful. I'll have our team prepare some preliminary terms. I already have mine," I replied, and named the number. Not outrageous, not vindictive, just market rate for enterprise fraud prevention systems, plus consulting fees, plus a little something for the 15 years they'd spent not asking what I was capable of. There was a long pause. "That's significantly higher than we anticipated. You'll want to run it by Brad," I said. "You have 2 weeks. I hung up before she could negotiate because we both knew what came next. Meetings, justifications, explanations to executives about how they'd missed a $58 million opportunity that had been developed 4 doors down from the corner office. That afternoon, I took a meeting with a recruiter from Highland Financial Group, a firm Brad had once called old-fashioned and risk-averse, which was corporate code for more successful and stable than we are. The recruiter was direct. "We've been following your project. Sentinel Risk made a smart move, but we want you. Chief Risk Officer position, full autonomy, your own development team, build whatever you think the industry needs." She paused, then smiled. "Also, we'll contract with you separately for RiskGuard Pro. Different agreement. We don't touch your intellectual property." They'd done their homework. That alone put them miles ahead of Whitmore. I told her I'd consider it, and I meant it. Not because I was running away, but because for the first time in 15 years, I had real choices backed by real leverage. That night, I sat in my home office, opened my personal laptop, and looked at the RiskGuard Pro dashboard I'd designed 2 years earlier. Thousands of transactions processed, 0 false positives, clean data visualization, everything working exactly as intended. When they wanted in now, they could ask. But I wasn't obligated to say yes. It was the first Monday in February when I finally cleaned out my desk. Not because I had to, but because I'd made my decision. Highland Financial had offered everything Whitmore never thought to: respect, resources, and recognition for what I could actually accomplish. My badge still worked when I swiped in, but the floor felt different. Quieter conversations, careful glances, the particular politeness people use around someone they've fundamentally underestimated. I passed a few colleagues in the hallway. Roger nodded more respectfully than he had in years. Mike actually stopped to shake my hand. "Congrats on everything," he said. "Really impressive work." Brad's office was empty, chair pushed back like he'd left in a hurry. A few papers scattered on his desk, including what looked like a printout of the Sentinel Risk Solutions press release. I gathered my personal items. A coffee mug from a banking conference, a small desk plant that had somehow survived on fluorescent light and neglect, a flash drive labeled backup protocols that had probably saved their compliance rating more times than anyone realized. As I was packing, Patricia Coleman appeared in my doorway holding a folder. "I gathered your transition documents," she said, offering a professional smile. "Everything's been processed. Thank you." She hesitated. "We heard about the Highland Financial opportunity. That's a significant role." I nodded. "It is. If you ever wanted to consult back here, help with the learning curve." I looked at her for a moment. She meant well, but she was still thinking small. Still thinking like someone who believed I'd been lucky instead of someone who'd been building solutions while they argued about org charts. "Depends on the project," I said, which was polite but non-committal. She smiled nervously. "Fair enough." There was a pause, the kind that acknowledged we both knew this conversation was really about the $58 million sitting in accounts they'd never see. I picked up my box and headed for the elevator. As the doors closed, I caught one last glimpse of the floor, where I'd spent 15 years being reliable, dependable, and invisible. Now they could see me perfectly. I just wasn't there anymore. The press release went live at 3:47 p.m., not from me, not with any fanfare. Just Highland Financial Group announcing their new Chief Risk Officer and exclusive partnership with industry-leading fraud prevention technology. The article opened with a quote about transformational risk management designed by a veteran banking professional with deep industry expertise. They called RiskGuard Pro foundational technology for next-generation financial security. And right there, in the second paragraph, Alan Pierce, former senior risk architect and founder of RiskGuard Pro. No mention of Whitmore. No footnote about where the technology had been overlooked or dismissed. Just the truth, clean and documented. I got a text from my wife 5 minutes later. She'd seen it on LinkedIn and was laughing so hard she could barely type. My grown son called from Denver, proud and amazed. "Dad, I had no idea you were working on something that big," but the message that mattered came at 6:23 p.m. A text from an unknown number. Highland Financial, internal use. "Congratulations. Would love to discuss consulting opportunities. Coffee sometime." I stared at it for a moment. The phrasing was careful, professional, like someone who'd learned not to make assumptions about what I might or might not be interested in doing. I didn't reply immediately, didn't delete it either, just let it sit there, unearned and uncertain. Some relationships don't need saving. They just need ending cleanly, without drama, like closing a file you'll never need to open again. 3 months later, I was sitting in my new corner office at Highland Financial when the news broke. RiskGuard Pro had prevented a $15 million fraud attempt at one of our major clients. The system I'd built in my spare time, the one Brad had dismissed as a garage project, had just saved someone's entire quarterly profit margin. The industry recognition came quickly after that. Banking Technology magazine called it Innovation of the Year. Risk Management Weekly featured me on their cover with the headline The Quiet Revolution in Fraud Prevention. I framed that one, not out of ego, but because it captured something important. 15 years of being overlooked had taught me that the best revenge isn't making noise. It's making something so undeniably valuable that silence becomes impossible. I put my phone away and walked out to my office window. The evening was clear, city lights stretching out below. Somewhere across town, Brad was probably reading those same headlines, trying to calculate exactly how much opportunity he'd missed by not asking better questions. He wouldn't find his name anywhere in the coverage, because I hadn't built my future with him. I'd built it without him, and now everyone could see the difference. The quiet ones aren't always planning revenge. Sometimes we're just planning ahead. Experience doesn't demand respect. It earns it by building something they can't ignore. The best validation isn't their approval. It's their regret for not recognizing what was right in front of them.